what is the goal of the types of statements that I just read through?
I think in general terms, a goal of these statements is to create a boundary or a guideline for the way that we engage in conversations and interactions in a community of learners. And I think it's an attempt by institutions to try to signal those elements and those values so that when we all get together and we do have our interactions, there's some guidance there, and there's hopefully some first principles to be able to go back to. Now, whether or not those actually are successful at creating first principles or some of those guidelines, that's up for debate perhaps, but I think that that's the intention for having these statements.
It would depend on which one in particular that you're referring to. But even just taking I think it was the last one that you said about not treating people the way that you would like to be treated, but how they would, it's assuming that the idea of keeping people comfortable. And I think that where that can get dangerous is because education is kind of by definition disruptive. Good education is going to mess with your head, for lack of a better phrase. And when people get uncomfortable with ideas, that then they can resort to, well, this isn't the way that I want to be treated. And that could perhaps make it very, very subjective, because everyone is in that kind of subjective bubble of what they would prefer, the way that they would want to be talked to. And in an educational context, I don't know if students are necessarily the ones to always decide what is the best. Is comfort going to be one of the best avenues for doing good education? Something along those lines.
I teach with a colleague that really focuses on logic and reasoning. The moment that we allow students to bring in emotional reasoning without the kind of opportunity where we have checks in place to insert more logic or fact or truth or evidence-based reasoning, then what happens is, and I think Haidt and Lukianoff talk about this in Coddling the American Mind, reasoning, is we oftentimes then find proof of the thing that is triggering us, and then that proof becomes the thing that gets raised up or becomes validated as the truth or the evidence. And in fact, the evidence that's being used really is secondary at that point, and we're talking about emotion. And if everybody gets to be able to share their own emotion, then we don't have a standard to be able to talk about ideas.
What is the impact on students' educational experience of being shielded from things that might make them uncomfortable or be challenged?
I guess I would just come back to that. I hope that we don't have educators that are actively trying to shield students from comprehensive, robust conversations where we are being able to insert I have a colleague that always talks about polarity of ideas, right? That we have on one side, here's documentation that supports this idea, and on this side here, this idea. Where can we have this conversation in the middle? That we continue to do that. Now, if a teacher is inserting her political ideology and not allowing for the rest of the polarity to happen, obviously that has great impact, negative impact on our students and our educational system. And in fact, hopefully we have strong administrators and other teachers that are willing to call that out, and we are willing to have open conversations about it. I fear that's not always the case.
The idea that offense is subjective. So unless we have, unless we recognize that it all has to be on the table, because otherwise, if we draw a line, the lines might be different. One person would be horribly offended, and they really are about the spicy food comment, and someone else isn't. Then how do you quantify that within the speech codes? Because it is so subjective, and that's the idea of impact over intent. But I think that that's a dangerous precedent to set in a school where we're trying to expose all ideas and then have almost like a competition of all ideas out there. So some people are removing like Huckleberry Finn because of the N-word usage and stuff like that. And I understand it, but I disagree, because I think that these are teachable moments to address how did saying that word make you feel, And why did it make you feel? What's the history of the word? There's so many opportunities to learn when you are offended on so many different levels, or when people are offended, or when you're uncomfortable. I think they're all just educational opportunities. And I think that's kind of the point of K through 12 education. I think that there is a danger in saying that certain topics are off limits because of a bunch of reasons, including that there could be backlash, that if you are protected by, let's say, your school institution as this is off limits, teenagers, I'm in the high school, like teenagers they're not just blindly rule followers. Like we know that they are rebellious and they will rebel, and it could rebel in very ugly ways. And I do worry about that, is that when certain things are off limits, do not, who can you not, insult, or who is off limits to criticize in any kind of way, the criticism will come. And I do worry that it will come in a very dark way if it's kind of off limits. And that's one of the many issues that I think is a problem if we go down that route.
Part of the role of the institution then is also to pick out these topics that we know need to be massaged in a little bit in this formative moment. We know that students shouldn't be having all these conversations in isolation because we push them there.
The issue with hate speech is, typically is like who decides what it is. And you might say the school decides, but if they're going to have hate speech regulation, it needs to be a two-way street. It needs to be in the spirit of like the 14th Amendment, which is equal protection of the law. Because what we're seeing now is, I think people saying like I'm against hate speech would be, you could do something, saying something like I disagree with transgender women playing in women's sports. That is hate speech. But saying I hate the president, that's not hate speech. So we need to have a very clear boundary so that they are equal. As long as the rules are equally applied, I think then we can get somewhere positive. But when they're aligned with a political ideology, where it's more of like a left-wing or right-wing political ideology that's guiding it, and we see this in the news all the time with the hypocrisy of calling out the other side but not calling out the same issues going on your side. I think that's a problem with the way that hate speech codes are being pushed out, is they're not two-way streets, and it's not treat everyone equally. It is treating people differently on the way to trying to get to equity. And I think that would be a problem. And we're talking about children. So we're talking about helping children to get the tools that they need in order to thrive out in the world. And they're fragile. They're fragile individuals. So if they are horribly offended, or they have they're prone to anxiety and depression, then that can shut them down too. So it's a very tricky situation that we're in. And the only way to figure out if we're doing it right is to have a lot of dialogue, to try and figure out where these lines go. And that's why something like ELA is so important, to try and figure this stuff out. Because if it just goes, well, none of this or all of this, it's not going to work. And we need to figure out and find exactly where to draw these lines and things like that.
This is how our classroom environment works when we discuss hard ideas and fraught topics. And I would share the way that your voice that's being shared with me via this family is being represented and being discussed, is available to students. I would show how these other documents are trying to help students push some thinking. And then I would share the questions that the students are dialoguing about. I would share the reflection that they had. And I would hope that I would have all of those resources available to share with this family to make sure that I, one, assure that they've been heard, two, can share that the care and intentionality that's being taken in a classroom environment by their teacher and the way that students are being asked to engage and reflect and move to the next thing. Those resources, I think, I would hope would fall on open-mindedness.
When people are offended or hurt, they are offended and hurt. And I think that that's really important to recognize that. And I think there's a real problem with people who are kind of advocating what I'm advocating for, which is, no speech codes or anything like that. Like, free speech, say whatever you feel and whatever you think, and let's test it all out. That it can be very cold. It can be very harsh. And that's not gonna help. What we have to do is we have to find common ground. We're trying to argue towards peace, not argue towards winning. We are very, very divided. And in addition to past trends is we have social media on our phones, and social media algorithms are just made to put us in echo chambers where we're not discussing and all this kind of stuff. So we need to have these discussions in school so that we can at least expose young people to alternative ideas than they already possess. Because
I believe in a virtuous citizenry, and part of that is through education and the free flow of ideas. And actually, I was talking with a colleague, a friend, right before I came on here, and she was just suggesting that, you know, we don't have this independent thought. It's influenced by so many factors. Will just named a big one with his phone, right? And therefore, like, we need opportunities to be able to come together and to have structured discourse. And, you know, so it's not overblown. I mean, this matters. And because it is, like Will said, is in the mainstream, and we're just, we're
not teaching critical thinking. We're not teaching the idea of, there's so much confirmation bias and straw man arguments for the quote unquote other side, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
And what we should be doing is trying to steel man, as opposed to straw man, steel man the other sides, so that, just like what Graham said in the beginning, is we need to understand why people disagree with us and really understand that fully. Otherwise, you don't really understand the problem. Try to prove your ideas wrong. How would that go? And I think that's a really useful activity to do, that I like to do with my students, is to take your ideas and try and prove them wrong, as opposed to prove them right. You have the internet, you can prove anything right, but flat earth. But if you want to try and prove something wrong and you can't, well, maybe you have something then.
Related to, you know, can you listen and repeat another's argument, even if it might be than your own? How do you write an essay that includes multiple perspectives before you provide the one that you are currently in line with?